Well, at least I'm going to do this. I'm not going to try to beat Chin in terms of moderation, but I'm going to try. This is my trial. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back from the coffee break. So in the last couple of days, we've been listening to our panelists, having conversations about impact measurement and management. It's been mentioned many times because it's very important for impact investing. And this afternoon, we have some dedicated time for that. So some of that time, Karim and I are going to take and talk about impact measurement and management. And after us, there is a panel about impact transparency, where we have a very strong, very interesting panel, and they are going to be talking about impact transparency. So, Karim, hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us here today and in Turkey, coming all the way from Canada. And Karim is a globally recognized researcher, education, and practitioner in the fields of impact investing and impact measurement. And he's also the founding program director of Oxford Impact Measurement Program. This is a very brief introduction, and I don't think I'm doing any justice to it. Karim, I'm going to ask you to tell us about your background and your experience in impact investing and impact measurement, because it's relevant to our conversation, and I really would like our audience to really know you well.
I'll keep it short, though, because we'll get into the content. But just to frame this, so it's nice to be back here, I'd say I have these two hats. One is really trying to answer this question of, in what ways does capital or business actually have an impact? So all of the different combinations of bringing capital and kind of market approaches in service of impact. And then increasingly, the second question of how do we know that anything changed? What is that impact? How do we measure it in the right ways? And so I've spent quite a bit of time on that first question, and we can talk a little bit about that, particularly in the Canadian context, but also globally. So there might be some lessons I think we'll talk about for Turkey. And then I think our conversation is mostly on the second question, which I think is the harder question of how do we know anything has changed? So I've done that, through a variety of roles. I'm, I think, a practitioner first. So while I represent a university right now, that's, about a third of my time where I do executive teaching. And the 2/3 is really all practice. So I work with a range of different impact investors, everything from, family offices we talked about earlier, foundations, financial institutions, but also those that are building the ecosystem. And so some part of my work is with people who are actually building and designing things to make them real. And the other is, how do we know those structures, the ecosystem, actually is delivering in the most aligned and integrated ways, which is why we're all here. We're all different parts of the ecosystem. So some part of my work has been, how do we support and build and create thriving ecosystems around impact so that everyone knows how they relate to each other, and that when we talk about issues like measurement, we have confidence that the answers around, is anything changing, are real, are credible, and that we actually can measure whether we're moving forward in the right ways or not.
Thank you very much, Karim, for that. I know that you led, I've been told, I read about it, and I live in Canada now, so I know well. You led initiatives in Canada in the early days of impact investing that were fundamental to the development of the ecosystem in Canada, impact investing ecosystem in Canada. And beyond that, through your consulting work or your alumni who come from all sorts of countries, you have witnessed or supported lots of people or countries in their development of their ecosystem. So we are going to talk about impact measurement, I promise, but I feel it would be a miss not to ask you, what can we learn? What can you tell us about sort of building a new ecosystem in impact investing in a country?
Yeah, thank you. And it's been, virtually to follow the early steps of this ecosystem with Shafak and Jada and others. It's been great. So maybe I'll reflect on my own experience from Canada and then globally. I co-founded the leading impact investment firm in Canada. We did a lot of market building over 10 years ago. So essentially, where you are now, that's where I was probably about 12 or 13 years ago in the Canadian ecosystem. Sila, who was here yesterday, provided a good overview of how far we've come We now have a $750 million wholesaler that is distributing, some very flexible capital in ways that we only dreamed about 15 years ago. And so it's been quite the journey on how do you move from an early stage of providing awareness, providing examples, and then thinking about what the end game looks like. And so I'll share some examples from that. The other is that many of you know this term impact investing it's not new. We've been doing impact investing in many ways for multiple millennia maybe, or certainly decades. But the term came from the Rockefeller Foundation that had convened a set of actors in about 2007, 2008. In 2011, they wanted to review the state of that grant-making portfolio. They spent $40 million to build this field. And so I was one of the co-authors of that evaluation. So in 2012, we looked and said, first 5 years of impact investing globally, what have we achieved? Where is it at? What are some of the lessons we can take for the next 5 to 10 years? So I tried to listen over the last couple of days and maybe offer some lessons. So I'm going to try and give you a few based on what we've done in Canada as well as globally. I would say the first is that to recognize there are many entry points for impact investing. In the US, for example, there was a lot of foundations that were fundamental to building the impact investing sector. In other countries, you had government leading. In other areas, I'm going to assume that you'll have corporations and family offices leading the way. And so again, I would say here, don't assume there's only one entry point for how you build the field. And I was telling Shafak, the program you have set out, even for your first summit, is quite remarkable in that you've covered the full range of entry points in a way that I don't think any other country at this stage of your development has. Because often it's led by one actor, and it's dominated by one actor, whether it's foundations or government, and here I feel it's a lot more distributed. The panel earlier also gave a really good sense of that. So that's a strength, and I would encourage you to keep that. The second lesson I would say would be to be ambitious even if you have to be patient. What I mean by that is this work takes a long time. It can be non-linear. Even in Canada, we had this goal at one point, hey, let's create a wholesaler like the Better Society Capital, Big Society Capital in the UK. We were inspired by the UK at that point. It took us 10 years after someone put that down on paper for it to become a reality. That's a really long time, but there was a lot that was happening before that. So I would say where you are right now, be as ambitious as you'd like. Raise the bar, even if you think you might not get there, because chances are that is going to inspire you to get there much quicker. The third thing I would say, which has been a mistake that some other countries and ecosystems have done, is that they have built one part of the market and not the other. And specifically, they have focused on supply of capital, so worked a lot with investors, tried to get mainstream capital involved, and spent a lot of time unlocking or mobilizing capital for impact. And then when that finally happens, they realize, oh, there's no structures, there's no deals, there's not impact measurement frameworks in place, there's no policy. And then everything else is struggling to keep up. And again, I was very impressed by the way that you've set out the agenda, because you've addressed all of those other elements around what's needed to build the ecosystem from day one. This was one of the findings from the Rockefeller work initially, was that a lot of the theory of change for field building started with the notion that if we unlock capital, then everything else is going to happen. It doesn't work that way. You have to build everything in parallel, and you have to connect the dots and create trust, as we heard in the previous panel, much more quickly and in the early days, not just wait 5 years from now. So I'm glad that you're already doing that. And finally, I would say that you can design for both scale and for impact at the same time. What I mean by that is that in impact investing, for a long time, we've had this obsession with scale. We want to be able to mobilize and bring together millions or billions of dollars, and again, that will change everything, right? If you get hundreds of millions of dollars, you'll get hundreds of millions of dollars of impact. It doesn't really work that way. As we've talked about yesterday, place-based impact investing is really about getting the nuance of what impact looks like, which might almost by definition need to be much smaller scale. But as a big and diverse country, you might say that on some things like employment and housing and renewable energy, you need a massive fund or set of funds. But it's not an either or. And I think in some places they've actually made the mistake of saying, let's just optimize for scale. because that's what the financial markets want to see. And I actually think that it's not an either or, it's an and. How do you do a scalable version of impact investing as well as a deep, highly like communal version and place-based version of impact investing together? You know, the experience of Canada is not one country. It's a set of provinces, it's a set of cities. And if you try and talk about one version of impact investing, it doesn't exist. And my guess is that here, just seeing all of you in the room, there are multiple versions of impact investing that exist in your context. So don't forget that, because that actually is a strength, not a weakness. And I think some other countries have actually sacrificed the diversity around impact investing, you know, in a way that they've had to come back to 5 or 10 years later. So those are just some quick remarks, but yeah, we'll get into impact measurement now, I suppose.
Yes, yes, absolutely. But thank you very much for sharing that. So I would like to get us to impact measurements slowly but surely. And I would like to start with definitions, because definitions are very important in impact measurement. And I mean, I think we talked about this. It was amazing to see the enthusiasm, the passion about impact focus, initiatives, investments, projects, and everything. And in those conversations, I noticed in some of the conversations, there was a clear distinction between ESG and impact. And in some other conversations, they were almost used interchangeably. And I did come across the same situation in other contexts as well. So I don't think it is specific for this audience, but you know, it is a common, I think, confusion in terms of, you know, impact versus ESG. My understanding is that, and knowledge of ESG is that it's a risk management framework, and it's about understanding what's out there that will affect my business or the performance of my investment, and how do I mitigate those risks? How do I understand, measure, and mitigate those risks? Whereas, and it is so in that sense, it is outside in. So it's what's happening outside, how it's affecting me. Whereas impact is the other way around. It's more about what do I do, and how does what I do impact the people, the communities, the environment around me. So for me, that is the distinction. But I wanted to also take your take on it, and also why is it important to differentiate?
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think that is a really clear and good way of describing the challenge. And we use terms like materiality, single materiality, double materiality to express that. I'll just provide some fundamental starting points, because I think those are helpful, and then I'll talk about the difference using an example between ESG and impact. So one starting point is every organization has some kind of social or environmental impact. We just haven't had the equivalent of financial accounting to be able to encompass all of that value, positive or negative, that is being created. So what financial accounting did, which took about 100 years or so, we're now maybe in our second decade for impact accounting. So we're in a very early stage relatively, but it's moving much quicker. So whether it's by regulation or demand or confusion, the good news is that we are essentially developing a new set of language, tools, frameworks, and mindsets in a way that allows us to account for all these things in a way that it took financial accounting 100 years. Now, I won't go through the whole history of it, but you know, there was a time where people thought that even comparing, you know, P&Ls was impossible. Maybe some of you think comparing different kinds of impacts today is impossible. You know, maybe 10 years from now, we'll look back on this and we'll be like, oh, that's fine, we solved for it. So I don't think it's going to take us 100 years, but I do want us to realize that the historical trajectory of developing these things, it does take time. And in some ways, we've accelerated that timeline because of regulation. The second point is that we've been measuring social impact for a really long time. You know, arguably, you know, multiple decades, maybe hundreds of years, we have assigned value to things that assign different kinds of value to things that we care about. And public sector and philanthropy, there's lots of ways to measure impact. So anyone that tells you impact measurement is hard, or it's new, or it's complex, it isn't all those things. It maybe is because of the range of factors that we find ourselves in right now. So, you know, I think impact measurement applies to everybody. So that's almost like starting point one. Every organization, if an organization says, I don't care about measuring my social impact, well, that means that maybe, you know, they should be doing it even more. The second thing is that we've been measuring for a long time, and actually measurement is easy to do. The hard part is what do we value, who decides what is worth measuring or not, and what do you do once you find out? That's the hard part. And as has come up over the last 2 days, that's about people. That's about relationships. That's about the consequences of measurement. And so in that way, just to now transition to the ESG versus impact, ESG really stops at the questions, as you were saying, around what are the things that are external that affect me? Often that's just about the bottom line, often that's about risk. Let's take the example of good jobs, right? You would say, does a company, how would they actually manage their ESG risks around employment? Well, they might just say, do we have safe working conditions as defined by the ILO, right, the International Labor Organization? So there might be a standard set of checkboxes, and then you meet all of those, and you get an audit once a year, and therefore you have managed your risk. The reality is that that model is broken. The processes of simply managing for risk or doing a kind of classic checkbox exercise, which is, depending who you ask, what ESG has become. Impact in some ways recognizes this and goes much further. And it goes further in a few different ways. Many of you, I think, might be familiar with the impact management project's dimensions, the 5 dimensions of impact. This is one of the things in the last 6 or 7 years we spent a lot of time trying to standardize this language of, when we say impact, what does it mean? So it means at least these 5 dimensions. It might mean, who are you targeting? And in this case, we're not just saying all employees. You might say, well, what defines an employee who has a better quality of life versus one or who works for the company directly versus indirectly? What defines a quality of life or a good job or a type of, nature of income? For some of us, getting paid on time is more important than, let's say, an additional benefit that you might never use. But if somebody has made the judgment that actually a benefit that I provide my employees is my social impact, when that person has said, actually, just pay me on time or pay me more, this is the kind of challenging part about impact. So we want to ask, what is the impact or what is the effect? Who are we talking about and what defines them? How much impact? How do we define? Is it by some international standard? Is it by some relative standard? Again, sometimes we care about how does my income relate to, let's say, the national average. But more likely, you're concerned about how does my income relate to the person I work with. So there's a relative standard, not just an absolute standard. This is why impact measurement is tricky. It's not because it's hard to measure, it's because we have different value judgments when we answer these questions. And then impact also asks, what was my role in creating the changes? Whereas with ESG, often you are trying to understand what is the risk. With impact, you're trying to ask about what's my contribution. And finally, in impact, we want to be able to ask, what if the impact I was looking for did not materialize? Can I do anything about that? And this is becoming increasingly important in an era of greenwashing and impact washing, because companies make all sorts of claims and then don't actually follow through on them. Well, at some point, they're going to be held accountable for it. And so these are, just to give you a very, I think, simple example, when you trace employment, but you can apply that to any kind of outcome, you move much further when you ask impact questions than when we stop by asking ESG questions. And I think this is going to be important for even in the local context to just explain to stakeholders, because I think the corporates in the room in particular are going to be pushed much harder when they make claims around impact. And if you're not going further than ESG, then effectively the regulation is going to call you out for that. So why don't I pause there, because there's, not to turn this into like a mini lecture, but I think it is important because these terms are used interchangeably sometimes.
Absolutely, thank you for that and exemplifying that as well, Karim, that's really helpful. I'm going to come back to impact washing in a minute. And I just wanted to add something else to ESG versus impact. I almost see impact measurement as giving organizations like a foresight muscle, so that they measure those impacts, those effects on communities, stakeholders, environment now, so that those things don't come back as risks, as ESG risks in the future. Yeah. So I also sort of have that kind of,
That's right.
I don't know, conceptualization, if you like.
Well, let me, I mean, you've seen that the term we now use is IMM, Impact Measurement and Management. And this is a big shift, not just in the words, but actually in terms of what we mean, why it matters. It's intended to be a much more dynamic and value-added orientation to impact measurement. Now, some version of impact measurement has really emanated from a compliance and reporting perspective, right? So we look back at what happened based on all the things we said were going to happen, and if there's a variance, then it's a problem. The end management part completely flips the paradigm of what we're trying to do. We're trying to set some goals and aspirations around impact. We're doing a bunch of things, and in a more dynamic way are trying to get feedback. And we're using that information to make better decisions in the future. It moves from a reporting compliance model to a value add and management tool. And that shift is still underway. So I don't want to imply that we figured it out, but I think the paradigm shift of moving from reporting to value add is going to be very important as we think about what the IMM of the future looks like relative to what impact measurement looks like today.
I'd like to ask you something that it took a while for me to get my head around. I'm an impact measurement and management practitioner, but I come from the non-profit sector. So I've done that for over 10 years now in the non-profit sector. And when I started to look into that in the context of impact investing, we always say that one of the key elements of impact investing is impact measurement. That sort of sets it apart from other investing sort of practices. But I couldn't get my head around in terms of where it fits. Well, I mean, in the sort of investment cycle, it's probably because I didn't understand the investment cycle, maybe, I don't know. And so is it just, we don't talk about that. When do we do it? Do we do it at the end of the cycle? Do we do it in the beginning of the cycle? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, short history lesson, when impact investing started, the definition used the term intention. So an investor has an intention for impact. And for maybe the first 5 to 7 years, maybe even 10 years, that was enough. Even though the definition said, and you have to measure your impact. A lot of investors use their intention to create impact as their proxy to call themselves an impact investor. Obviously, that's not enough. So the last 5 to 7 years, we've been spending a lot of time on moving from intention to integration. So if you say you care about good jobs, you say you care about environmental impacts, how is that being integrated throughout your entire investment life cycle? So it's everything from, let's put it from the investor perspective. How would you define what your goals are? How would you screen for certain kinds of investments? How would you decide what types of KPIs you build? How do you then, once you make an investment decision, manage towards those impact goals the same way you manage towards your financial return and you manage your risk? So it's a very dynamic and integrated, holistic integrated process. And so a lot of investment or a lot of work has been done on moving from intention to integration. And I would say if you are in this phase where you're moving from intention to integration, no need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of standards and frameworks and tools and ways to do that. But 5 years ago, we didn't really have that. Everybody used intention, and then we're trying to find ways to integrate it. Now the expectation is that every investor fully integrates their impact intent throughout their investment life cycle. The next phase, or the next challenge in some way, is around integrity. Do I believe that what you're telling me around your impact is actually true? Is it accurate? Is it representing the reality of the context within which you are operating? Are you exaggerating your results? And this is where we have this question of impact washing. So I would say, again, impact measurement should be done at all stages. This is why we talk about it as IMM, impact measurement and management. It's not the thing you do once a year. I would even say that if you find yourself in an organization where every December or every March, depending on your end fiscal, they're like, oh, we have to do an impact report. You're doing it wrong. An impact measurement approach should be done essentially year-round. The same way we manage our financials, right? We would want to have some targets and goals. We have a strategy. We review these weekly, monthly, quarterly. You should be able to have a similar orientation around impact. And if your impact conversation is once a year, what happened, what are we going to say, then you have to flip the paradigm because you're not getting the value from impact measurement that you should be getting. And I think a lot of organizations struggle with that because they're moving from an annual reporting cycle to something that's more dynamic. But again, if you just flip it and say, how do we manage ourselves normally, you would never wait an entire 12 months to decide whether you're doing the right thing. So why do we accept that for impact? Because if you're in the business of impact, you're not going to wait a whole year to know whether you had impact, right? So I think that for me, this is a paradigm shift, but also the tools and practices we have now actually are much simpler in order to do that.
So impact washing, we talked a little bit about that, which is the biggest challenge, I suppose, for impact measurement.
Yeah.
And I'm also conscious of the time that we have to wrap it up in a minute. But I wanted to ask you maybe to combine two questions I had for you. Let's try to be positive. What are some of the opportunities? And especially now being here, listening to us for the last 2 years, and also following the development of the ecosystem in Turkey for a few years through your students, if you like. So what are some of the opportunities? What are the opportunities for Turkey in terms of impact measurement and management that you should see?
Yeah, no, so I'll talk about the opportunities very quickly on the challenge of impact washing. I would say that if you're doing it right now in some way, intentionally or unintentionally, you're going to get called out, whether it's social pressure, regulation, something else. Pretty much any claim to impact you've made that you can't back up, you're going to get called out. To use the language of corporate or investment, there's headline risk, there's reputational risk, and there are material risks to essentially overclaiming impact. And if you look at your impact report today, or another stakeholder looks at your impact report and has questions, essentially you need to fix that very quickly, because I understand the deadline for September is coming up very quickly. And so get all of that in order, because in the EU in particular, but also within the ISSB, the regimes around verification, regulation, and consistency are coming in super fast, certainly faster than any other regulations related to mainstream accounting that we've seen before. Let me talk about the opportunities, because I think that's much more fun. The good news, I think, about impact measurement and IMM in particular, you can think about this as the intersection of multiple fields. So regardless of where you sit in the ecosystem, you have some part of your job that is related to impact measurement. And I find that quite exciting, because if you've been trained in accounting or economics or psychology or computer science, you have an entry point into impact measurement and IMM. And so for me, one big opportunity is ensuring that the full ecosystem has the ability to influence what IMM becomes in a way that sometimes when we think about singular professions is very exclusionary. IMM can really incorporate a lot of different perspectives. The second is there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Much of the heavy lifting on standards and frameworks and tools has been done in the last 5 years. So again, regardless of whether you're measuring anything or not, you don't need to actually rebuild anything, and much of it's available for free. And so maybe we can share the links now, because certainly here in Turkey as well, there's been some work that already has been done that you can speak to around this. And then I would just say the final opportunity before we talk a little bit more about this is, I think I mentioned this briefly earlier, these standards at the global level, and particularly around S, the social impact, are being defined at a global level now. But nobody's got the answer, per se. And, as I mentioned earlier, some of it comes from a quite Western and traditional kind of orientation that perhaps doesn't include a lot of the complexity and contextual relevance that we find in emerging markets. And so for me, one of the most exciting opportunities is to say, how do other countries, apart from the ones we know are setting the rules in the past, really have a voice and change the way that we think about impact measurement in the future? What are the things we want to be able to measure? How do we think about good jobs, differently when we think about our communities? But as was mentioned in the previous panel, a lot of this work is around the relational aspects of impact measurement, not just the technical pieces. We can measure a lot of things, but how do we measure the strength of a community? Do we think it matters to measure the strength of a community? Do we think that how a household describes whether they're in a better or worse position should only be by how much income, the household gets? There's a lot of other things that we would like to account for that are values-based, that are contextual. And I think for me, this is the most exciting opportunity. 10 or 15 years from now, we want to be able to come up with global standards that reflect the richness of the experiences that we have in all of our countries. And so I think that's the big opportunity for Turkey and a few other countries like you to be able to say, how do we contribute to the global conversation? How do we redefine some of the measures around social impact and environmental impact? And what does it mean to provide the best case studies that will be used at the global level? I think you can get there, and certainly from the accelerated pace of what you've done so far, I would love to see that in my own teaching. So maybe I'll pause there and you can talk about what we've done so far.
I think Tuğçe and Darren also mentioned these. These are basically the links to some of the resources that you can find in EYDK's website, the recordings of the IMM summit. Some of them are in Turkish, some of them are in English. But there's also a white paper that is in Turkish that we put together in 2021. And as Etkiyap, actually, we have been, since our inception, working really hard on impact measurement and management, and we do have social return on investment training programs and also training programs on SDG impact standards, which is not only about IMM, but there's a huge component of it. So those are some of the resources that you can maybe go into to sort of start looking at IMM in the context of impact investing.
And again, just to congratulate you on this, because I don't think there's another country, at least that I know, that at the beginning of their ecosystem building collective work has done this. And even the IMM summit, which took place before the Impact Investing Summit, I think is remarkable because it shows the commitment to doing this well. And I think it's going to stand you in like the right stead when you look around at your peers and say, what are the parts of the ecosystem? Everybody's going to deal with impact measurement later, and they're going to be frustrated because they haven't figured it out. Because you started early, you're going to get there, and you're going to have lessons for everybody else. So I'm pretty excited to see what you do.
Thank you very much, Karim. Please join me to thank Karim for sharing his insights and his knowledge with us.